well you digest food like starches and sucrose. The low FODMAP diet doesn't really eliminate all sucrose, which is table sugar, but a small number of people, that could be part of their digestive problems. So with carbohydrates making up a big part of our diet, from bread, pasta, potatoes and rice, and of course sugary foods, how would you know if you had an issue with those foods and that was causing your IBS-like symptoms? That's what I'm going to be going through this week on the Inside Knowledge podcast, sharing how you can get tested, what your symptoms might look like, and of course how to manage an intolerance to breaking down sugars. Hello, welcome to episode 101 of the Inside Knowledge podcast for people with IBS. I'm Anna Mapson. This week I'm talking about sugar intolerance, or an inability to break down common starches and sugars, and this was something that my email audience have requested. So if you're not already signed up to my email list, then there will be a link in the show notes. Every now and again I ask my audience which episode they would like me to record first, and this came up last week. So this is for all those people who requested it. The reason people are interested in it, I think, is that we kind of know we're eating too much sugar most of the time, and we kind of know it's not good for us, but obviously it's so freely available. But I'm not just talking about added sugars today. This goes above and beyond like just eating a lot of glucose and sugary foods, sweets, chocolates, etc. And it actually is more about how your body is able to break down a particular type of sugar, but also common starches. So things like grains, even potatoes and rice. If you've already tried the low FODMAP diet, but it didn't work for you, it could be an additional layer of carbohydrate breakdown that is missing. So we're going to talk a bit about how we break down carbohydrates. So essentially we need to get every type of sugar down to the smallest molecule so it can be absorbed. Each cell will absorb some of the nutrients like vitamins, minerals, fats, proteins. They all get broken down to their smallest molecule and then they kind of get absorbed into the cells. So we have things like glucose, fructose. Those are kind of the most common basic elements that we want to get down to. So sugar, table sugar, is sucrose, and that is broken down into one glucose and one fructose molecule. You might want to listen to episode 83 where I talk about different sugars and how they get broken down. But just as a little reminder, sucrose is broken down into glucose and fructose. Lactose becomes glucose and galactose. And then maltose is another type of sugar that becomes two glucose molecules. So two glucose together is a maltose. And today I'm going to be talking about difficulties in breaking down sucrose, which is the table sugar, but also maltose. And these are very common. They're in loads of foods that we eat, just normal sort of foods. It's not always added sugars. It's naturally occurring grains and vegetables and fruits. The first digestion for carbohydrates starts in the mouth. As you're chewing your food, you can have enzymes in your saliva, and that starts to break down the carbohydrates in the mouth. And you can notice this if you have a piece of bread and you chew it for a really, really long time. You may find that it ends up tasting a little bit sweeter, and that is because the sugars are breaking down and you can now access glucose from the bread. And that's not necessarily added sugar to the bread, it's just naturally occurring. Then as food goes down into your small intestine, that's where a lot of the digestive enzymes are really, really active. So we have brush border enzymes that are in the tube of our small intestine. There's little protrusions, finger-like villi, that's sticking out, and at the ends of these there are various brush border enzymes that help us break down our food. If we don't do that job very well, what happens is larger particles of the food that are not broken down sufficiently will travel to the large intestine, and they also draw water in to the gut, which can cause bloating, gas, cramping, diarrhea, really common IBS symptoms. So this is where you can see people can get a little bit confused with the symptoms. So there are enzymes I've talked about before on this podcast, like lactase breaking down lactose, etc. This particular one I want to talk about today is called sucrose-isomaltase, and it's breaking apart sucrose and it's breaking apart maltose, and these are in a lot of common foods that we're eating. So you can have an issue With the production of this enzyme from birth, you can be born with a genetic predisposition to not create as much of this enzyme as other people, and that is called a primary carbohydrate malabsorption issue. You normally will see this identified quite early on in childhood, and children who have a lot of diarrhea and problems with IBS that are just not getting resolved no matter what, like how healthy their diet is and no matter what other things they're trying. It's quite rare, I suppose, to have this. It's called congenital sucrose-isomaltase deficiency. But there is a sliding scale, and also you can have an issue that develops later in life. So this is a primary carbohydrate malabsorption problem that is genetic. People who have this will struggle to digest any kind of sugary sweets, cakes, like yogurts, any sort of processed food with added sugar, but also things like honey, cereals, and grains, and even like vegetables like sweet potato and starchy vegetables. You can also have genetic issues that impair the production of this enzyme but don't completely rule it out. And what I found really interesting is that people who have IBS are more likely to have a slight genetic modification that could be affecting their digestion. I found one study that showed that like nearly 10%, I think it was just over 9.2% of people with unexplained IBS had a deficiency in all four of the most common digestive enzymes that we have that break apart lactose, sucrose, maltase and other sugars. People who have got IBS that's uncontrolled may have a genetic predisposition to making less of this enzyme. That then means you are going to struggle with foods that are high in these common starches. There also have been other studies looking at how you can develop a problem with this enzyme later in life. If you've listened to the episodes I've done about SIBO, then you'll know that having a lot of bacteria in the gut can also really interfere with enzyme production. And some people find that their tolerance to certain carbohydrates will go up when they have resolved the SIBO. And this is why you should always be looking at identifying a treatment for SIBO, not just hoping it goes away, because often it doesn't, and your diet could be quite restricted in that whole time. And this is potentially where some people really do get a significant reaction to eating sugary foods and find that they do better on a low carb diet or on the low FODMAP diet, where some of these are naturally reduced. As well as that primary genetic cause of having less of these digestive enzymes, people can also develop it later in life, and this might be down to any damage that you've had to your small intestine. It could be from an injury, from an accident or surgery, where it's like physical damage to the lining of the gut that has blocked the production of those enzymes. Could also be inflammatory conditions like inflammatory bowel disease, where patches of the body just are getting ulcerated and unable to produce the enzymes as effectively. And then also things like celiac disease, if it is going undiagnosed and you are still eating gluten unknowingly and you are creating a lot of inflammation and rawness in the gut, then that can also affect digestive enzyme production. Taking certain medication as well might also change your ability to break down sucrose in the gut. Things like ranitidine, which is to stop stomach acid production, and also codeine, which is a pain medication, have both been shown to reduce sucrase activity in your small intestine. So if you're taking those regularly, maybe it's long-term going to affect what kind of food you can eat. And then also, interestingly, some infections like parasite infections. The good news is, though, if you have this secondary inability to break down certain sugars because your enzyme is impaired, when you resolve the underlying cause, normally it can go away. So, for example, if you get celiac disease diagnosis and then you go gluten-free and your gut starts to heal up, if you take the right medication for your inflammatory bowel disease, like whatever the cause is, once you get to the bottom of that, generally your ability to bounce back is really good. The important thing to pull out as well is that some of the foods that are high in starches and sugars that may be a problem for some people generally are very good for us in the gut. When I'm talking about the naturally occurring, like I'm not talking about loads of cakes and chocolate and stuff. But if you think about fermentable fibres, some of those are very high in starch as well, and we actually do want them for our large intestine gut bacteria. And this is why I don't recommend everybody with IBS just goes low carb just to be safe, or just to remove things, like to try. So yes, cutting out those foods may be worth a trial, but it's not the way you want to live. Like, we really do rely on carbohydrates for a lot of our energy intake, and some people that I work with will really struggle going on a low carb diet and cutting out all of these sugars. The reason you don't need to cut all of them out, even if you do have a genetic problem, is that the amount of sugar, the types of sugars, like the speed of your digestion, what gut bacteria you've got in the small and large intestine will all have a really big impact on your ability to break it down. Even if you've got this inherited deficiency, then you can still tolerate a small amount of this sugar. It's not like there's nothing that you can eat that's any kind of sweetness. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about what you can do if you think this might apply to you. So how would you get tested? And also, if you can't get testing, what are some of the treatments or some of the ways that you could look at managing it? So first of all, the testing is not really commonly available on the NHS. The two main ways that you get tested is either having the blood test to look for the genes, and that would be something you would probably get done in childhood. And then secondly, if you're looking for physical signs of sugar malabsorption or sugar intolerance, they will do a small biopsy down your esophagus into the duodenum. And so they'll take a small sample of the tissues, maybe some of the juices. Now that is a very invasive procedure, and definitely you wouldn't really inflict that on a child unless they had to. But for anybody, it's not really pleasant, and it can be quite costly. So the alternative is a breath test, and it's similar to the hydrogen breath test that we use for SIBO, but this is just using sucrose as a substrate. So normally the SIBO test uses lactulose or glucose, but this is a sucrose breath test looking at how much hydrogen is produced after taking a small amount. So this, I would say, would be really hard to get a diagnosis of, and that is partly because it's a secondary symptom almost of another condition. So as I mentioned, celiac disease, IBD, maybe SIBO, those are the things that you want to get treated, and then hopefully this symptom will get better. So if you think about what you can do and what ways you've got of treating it yourself, my first bit of advice, I think, would be if you think that you have got one of these other conditions I've mentioned, do get some treatment for those. If you think you've got SIBO, get tested. Make sure that you get treatment for SIBO. If you've got a positive SIBO breath test, that would be the first thing. If you've got, questions about celiac disease, make sure that you have a proper test for the antibodies in celiac disease, but you have to have eaten the gluten, all of those things. You can listen to episode 73 where I talk about celiac disease if you want more information on how to get tested for that. In terms of your diet, before launching into cutting out all sugars or carbohydrates, I suggest you try the low FODMAP diet first. It is quite a bit more varied than just going completely low carb, and will give you access to foods like oats, maybe rice, potatoes that do contain some starches, but could still reduce the fermentable aspects of your diet. So think about the low FODMAP diet first if you haven't done it. If you've done it but you're not quite sure if it was accurate, get some help to do it, and that is the kind of thing that I work with my clients on, is making sure that you're following the diet properly so that you're actually going to get the benefit out of it. It's such a lot of hassle, such a lot of work. Make sure that you are getting it done really properly so that you can understand the data and that you know what you're expecting to find with this dietary change. So that would be the first thing. Secondly, you may want to supplement your enzyme production. If you had a lactose deficiency, for example, you could take an enzyme containing lactase, which helps you break down the lactose. They've identified that a beneficial yeast is a really good way of increasing your capacity to digest sucrose. So there's a beneficial yeast you might have heard me talk about before called Saccharomyces boulardii, and this belongs to a family of beneficial yeasts called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. I think I'm pronouncing that right. This is a good probiotic yeast, which is not like candida, like we don't want tons of that overgrowing, and it's related to brewer's yeast. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae is brewer's yeast that eats up the sugar in your gut, and it has been shown to break it down and to aid your digestion of sugar. So you can either try brewer's yeast, which is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a kind of very well-known probiotic. And I find that people get on really well with it. It's well tolerated and doesn't cause too many upsets in the same way that adding in live bacteria can, particularly if you're someone who has SIBO already. Consider whether taking something that helps you break down the starches, the sugars, could boost your tolerance of foods, and that means that then you can eat a more diverse diet. Maybe you can tolerate a bit more of those starchy foods like grains, which are going to be so beneficial for your large intestine bacteria. I don't suggest that everybody just cuts out all carbs and goes on to like the Atkins diet or the paleo diet or like whatever variation of this you want to call it, but there are lots of diets that just have basically meat and then very low carb vegetables. Now, this is potentially why some people do get on better on a very low carb diet or a ketogenic diet, where they're removing all of these starches. The problem with those diets is that over time, they can lead to problems with your large intestine gut bacteria, and certainly if you're following a ketogenic diet with very, very high fats, it's well studied that you can have increases in cholesterol and other lipid markers like triglycerides, especially the bad type of cholesterol. So I wouldn't suggest somebody eats like that. The other reason for not cutting out all carbohydrates is that some enzyme production relies on having some of the carbohydrate substances in there. Now, we see this a little bit with lactose. If you don't have any lactose for a long time, it may be that your body doesn't bother making it. And then if you were to have a really big milky drink, some hot chocolate or a latte or something, it can overwhelm your capacity to digest. You can get the same kind of issue with your carbohydrate malabsorption. So, for example, if you don't ever eat whole grains and starchy vegetables, maybe your body won't readily produce the enzymes, and so you can just start to train your body up to tolerate small amounts of these foods. It's a bit like with weight training. You don't just not go to the gym and then suddenly go on all the machines and go wild, or not do any running training and then suddenly go and try and run a half marathon. Like, this would overwhelm your capacity. So it's the same with your digestion. You need to not overwhelm yourself by taking small steps. For example, if you were looking at the sorts of foods that could be tolerated, then you try and increase them little bit by bit. There is a particular diet that seems to be well tolerated where you're reducing the amount of starch and sucrose. So this is different to the low FODMAP diet. So they may be fermentable, but they are low in starch and sucrose. So this is a low starch and sucrose diet, and it was created for people who have that genetic deficiency. So they don't have the sucrose-isomaltase gene that makes that enzyme, okay? So things that you can eat a lot of, which tend to be lower in sugar, include avocado, blackberries. This is why I said it's different to the low FODMAP diet, right? Because those two are high in FODMAPs but low in starch and sugars. So this is where, if you've had a problem in the past with the low FODMAP diet, it might be worth looking at a different angle. Anyway, these foods, are low in sucrose. So avocado, blackberries, cherries, figs, grapes, gooseberries, kiwis, papaya, prunes, raspberries, loads of different fruits that you can eat that are actually quite low in sucrose. In terms of vegetables, there's loads as well: broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, celery, artichokes, aubergine, green beans, kale, mushrooms, radishes, tomatoes, courgette. And you'll see with those, what you don't have in the vegetable section is any of the starchy veg. So things like carrots, parsnips, sweet potato, butternut squash, beans and pulses, beetroot. These are like the more heavy vegetables. These would be less well tolerated because they are higher in starch or sucrose than what is thought to be well tolerated for most people who've got this genetic mutation that means that they don't produce enough of this enzyme. In terms of things that are not well tolerated, include apples, bananas, grapefruit, nectarines, mango, pineapple, tangerines, and peaches. So again, it's a little bit of a random selection if you're just to look at it and you don't necessarily know the starch or the sugar makeup of these foods, but you can get to know which ones might be good for you. And there's also a middle column of foods that are like maybe tolerated by some people, and that really very much depends on your own personal digestion. So the challenge with this diet is if you're someone who has been following the low FODMAP diet for years but still getting loads of problems, to increase these foods you may feel particularly worried. Okay, so just to summarise this episode, there is a possibility that you're not breaking down sugars as well as you could be, and this can be giving you some of those symptoms, especially if you have uncontrolled IBS that has been through the low FODMAP diet, you've tried various medications, your doctor's done all the tests. There is a potential for this to be one of the reasons why you react to certain foods. Okay, so the first line things to address would be, first of all, to try and work out what your underlying cause of carbohydrate malabsorption would be and try and get that under control, whether it's SIBO, IBD, celiac disease, whatever it is. Then try some dietary changes. I do suggest doing the low FODMAP diet first because on balance, it's more likely that removing the fermentable fibres is more likely proven to reduce symptoms. However, there is this low starch and sugar diet that's another aspect to some of your dietary issues, and it might be worth exploring in the short term. So this is not necessarily a diet that I suggest doing long term, and particularly because you will be really starving out your gut bacteria, and without the large intestine, good gut bacteria flourishing, diversity, like lots of good things going on there, you are more likely to have problems with immunity, maybe with your digestion. The good bacteria really help to protect the mucus lining of the gut, and we want a lot of good mucus there. We want to keep the gut healthy with lots of good bacteria. So by taking out all of these carbs, you're putting that at risk. Also, remember that when you haven't eaten carbs for a long time, you may need to train your body up, do some weightlifting for the gut by gradually introducing these foods and working your way up to it. Don't overwhelm your capacity to digest. So start small, but keep going. I hope you found this episode interesting. As I said at the beginning, this was one of the options that I presented to my email audience. And if you want to get a weekly email from me with loads of IBS and SIBO tips and info, then you can sign up via the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Inside Knowledge podcast. Better digestion for everyone.